All right. Welcome everyone to the Akron Software Craftsmanship Meetup. My name is Mark Harwood. I'm the main organizer of the group. We meet once a month on the third Thursday to discuss software development topics. We're an agnostic group, so there's no specific stack of focus. We usually meet in the Bounce Innovation Hub in downtown Akron. They're great, and we plan to return there in Q3 this year. If you're a remote worker and you're looking for a co-working space to just use to get out of the house, or you want to be collaborative with other, like-minded individuals, I love Bounce Innovation. I think the facility is awesome. Everyone that works there is super friendly and helpful and all of that. So please go check out the Bounce Innovation Hub in downtown Akron. I work at Robert Half Technology, which is a massive staffing and consulting firm. My main job is leading our professional service division, which is a group of 16 web, mobile, and data warehouse engineers who are full-time employees of Robert Half. And in either solo or in small groups, they go out and help companies throughout the Midwest build software or data warehouses and stuff like that. And then in general, Robert Half is here to help people find new jobs, or if you're a person who could use some help in locating new people to hire, I would be happy to coordinate any and all of that for you. So if you fall into that category, I'm very active on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me there. And yeah, we can talk about it. The other thing I wanted to make mention of are the Cleveland and Canton public tech Slacks. If you're not a member, I'll be dropping invites to both of those in the chats once John gets his presentation going. But yeah, they're essentially public tech Slack channels where people chat on a daily basis about development things and infrastructure things and just not work related things. And I'm a big community guy, so every time we meet at this group, I reference those Slacks and send out invites. So you'll see those in the chat soon. And yeah, for the duration of the presentation, we do want this to be interactive and collaborative when appropriate. So if John is referencing something and you have a question or a comment on it, feel free to politely interrupt him by unmuting and just asking. Or if you're more comfortable, you can just put it in the chat of the meeting and I will politely interrupt him for you. So yeah, without further ado, tonight's presenter is John Miller. We work together. We worked together for it'll be 6 years at the end of this year, so 5.5 years. And yeah, he's the man. I'm very happy that he raised his hand to do this presentation tonight. He will be talking to us about converting user requirements into time and tasks. So John, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. As Mark said, we've worked together for a long time and developed a really awesome working relationship. And I have watched pretty much all of these presentations so far and wanted to give a little bit more of a non-technical or soft skill integrated into our sort of technical world that we're working in. Conversation starter kind of presentation here. So like Mark said, this is going to be very interactive. I really encourage any feedback or conversation that you want to kick off from anything that's said in this presentation. A little bit about me. It's been, like Mark said, pretty close to 6 years here that I've been working at Robert Half Tech. Before that, I was spending roughly 2 to 3 years, depending on how you measure it, working in software development full time. I was working at a company that handled safety and fire and electricity clothing in the Medina, Ohio area. So I'm sure a few of you people out there are familiar with where that is. But I started work on software like a lot of people in this field from a young age based on an interest in video games in particular, and moved into web development and have had some really awesome opportunities through Mark and Robert Half and all of the personal networking connections that I've made over the years to work with some really, really cool companies and some really, really interesting and unique projects, anywhere from CES 2019. I had a really cool project that I managed there, to some anti-cyber terrorism projects. But I, on the personal side of things, am into pretty much any field of nerdery that you can think of. I grew up reading Lord of the Rings and playing JRPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, and the other end of the spectrum, I love endurance running, a little bit of rock climbing here and there, but I am currently training to run the Philly Marathon, hopefully qualify for the Boston. But in that vein, I love to move, both literally and metaphorically. A lot of what we do at Robert Half is working in a lot of different environments and exposure to a lot of different sorts of development situations. And that is one of my favorite things in the world to do, is to get a diverse exposure to a lot of different situations. So today we're going to be talking more about converting nebulous or sometimes deeply obfuscated requirements and requests from users into practical, quantifiable hours and tasks. And as I've said quite a few times in this conversation so far, I want this to be a starting point for either internal thoughts or verbal conversation between you and I, or between you and another developer, or between you and a non-technical person. So we're going to start going through the uses of the skills and the gotchas that you might encounter when you have actual physical numbers in front of you for tasks that you're assigned. We're going to talk about how to ask the right questions to get the information that you need to get to plan out your time and tasks effectively. We're going to talk about setting benchmarks, using those benchmarks to calculate the real world hours, and then how to leverage this information. Then I want to go over a couple of examples, and I do always appreciate a good rhyming scheme. So the example number one is titled Bad DevOps, and that's going to be something that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with anytime you're in a very red tape friendly environment, or anytime you're in a situation where requirements are not very clear. The second example is going to be something more developer friendly. So the benefits that you can have when you're in a situation where this isn't a critical concern, where you have control over your development tools, you have documentation, and you have access to the team members that you need to. And as Mark said, feel free to ask questions as they come up, but we will have some space at the end for Q&A if you have any questions left over. So diving right into it, I have heard a lot of developers over the years talk about the difficulty and the unintuitiveness that comes with taking a functional requirement and turning it into a quantifiable amount of effort. So I've over time developed this method, patent pending, to really solidify a process mentally and practically for taking these nebulous concepts and putting them into numbers. It's really been beneficial for me in avoiding scope creep. That's, I think, one of the biggest problems in our field. And having a measurable way of navigating through conversations regarding the scope of work that needs to be done and that can be done in a set amount of time can be a great way to mitigate those effects. Another benefit is that these are literal physical numbers that you can write down and you can send to a manager or a client or a team member as you see fit. Obviously, this doesn't apply to everyone, but billing can be a lot easier if you know how much work and what percentage of your free time is going to be spent working on something. Even if you're not one of the people that it applies to, this can be something that you can use to prioritize tasks in a more open software development lifecycle. The next part that we're going to dive into a little bit more is measuring improvement in personal growth. So when we talk about setting those benchmarks, that's going to be your basis for something that we're going to call quanta. And if you're familiar with quantum mechanics or any of that kind of science, you're going to be familiar with that term. But in this context, we're using it as a means to calculate these hours, and as a happy side effect, it's a great way to measure the growth that you have achieved as a developer or as an engineer over the time that you've spent in your career. I would like to offer a word of warning, though, that having literal numbers in front of you can make it easy to be unintentionally perceived as antagonistic. I think anytime you are the smartest person in the room, you are also the most intimidating person in the room. And that is a situation that needs to be approached with tact. So with that said, let's dive into asking the right questions. So any developer is going to be familiar with the temptation to strive towards perfectionism, which is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve in almost every situation. And I find that having that as a background goal while also having the literal numbers in front of you can be really helpful for striking a good balance between the two and leaving a situation with everyone happy. Another thing that I constantly like to remind developers of, and I like to remind myself, your boss is more important than logic. Your boss is more important than common sense. If your employer or your client or your manager gives you a requirement that you think is counterintuitive, it is an excellent idea to offer a logical, respectful rebuttal in writing in a way that you have documentation of. And then if they're not willing to hear it, just follow their lead. And if you need to, you have the space to say, I told you so. But that will be something that, especially with the ammunition that is the calculated hours that tasks will take, something that can be really helpful to keep in mind. The next point I have on here is that non-technical concepts, aka actual functionality, think the software that is completed in the imagination of the end user, whether that's you or a client or an employer, does not translate well into technical work, which is kind of what we're talking about here. So the major point that we're addressing is, how do we take these concepts, this finished product, and turn that into a formula or calculation, as so many of us development-oriented types like to. So I think it's good to seek guidance and challenge yourself. And those can often be mutually exclusive, even when they are counterintuitively so. So if it helps you more to not ask the question than it does to ask the question, I would encourage you to do that. But I constantly encourage people to communicate and communicate and communicate in writing, because if you're not communicating in writing, you're not really communicating. It might as well be hearsay or rumor. My dad grew up on a farm, and I have a bad habit of taking on a lot of work at a short period of time. Whenever I would do that growing up, he would always tell me, "How do you eat an elephant?" And the end of that statement, the end of that farm wisdom was always one bite at a time. So in that spirit, let's hop into the next bite. So setting your benchmarks is, what I mean by that is just that we're setting the minimum amount of time it takes to complete a quanta or a smallest possible unit of development. So if you're developing a UI, that might be something like a button. How long does it take you to add a button? Or if you're developing a data warehouse application, that might be something like mapping out a table and wiring that to whatever functionality you need. Or adding a column to an existing table. And this is something that I think is good to do literally and often. So if that means taking a Saturday, setting a timer on your phone, opening up Visual Studio Code or whatever IDE you usually work in, and making the kind of app that you most often write, then do that, and do that as often as you can, because this is the way that you're going to be able to measure the amount of progress that you've made as a developer. And this is the way that you're going to be able to figure out and get a sense for how long tasks are going to take you. If you have no idea where to start, I think a simple CRUD app is a good way to go. And if you're not familiar with that term, it's just create, read, update, delete. So a web application in whatever you're most comfortable with would be a great place to start setting these benchmarks. And if you've worked in development, this might come as second nature to you, but it's always a good idea to isolate your work to a sandbox, get rid of as many variables as possible. That's going to be true for benchmarks as possible. Don't guess, don't estimate, get real numbers on this. Estimations are going to be much less valuable in these kinds of conversations than practical benchmarks. So these quanta, these minimum amount of time spent on a task are going to be your leverage in any conversation about hours or tasks that you're going to have going forward. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as we go on. So the actual formula that I use is pretty easy to remember. It's QQQT, quanta times quantity times quality times time equals hours. And you're going to have, I'm sure, any number of additional variables that you add in there. It's a personal process, and it's going to take time to perfect it. A lot of it is muscle memory. There was a study done recently asking the question of whether development and software engineering and writing software is more of a mathematical skill or more of a linguistic skill. The results were actually interesting because they pointed more towards it being a memorization and puzzle solving skill, much more closely related to the parts of your brain that are accessed when you are literally figuring out a puzzle. So when I do things like this, I try to split them into heuristics, just mental shortcuts, categories that I can put my different types of work into. For me, and again, this is going to vary person to person, but for me, I've got mockups are a quarter of the time. Proof of concepts are going to be about half the time. A minimum viable product, so just showing off the actual functionality, is going to be 3/4. I benchmark based on a stable product, and then I put additional time for what I call a solid project. Those two terms I differentiate in that a stable product is not going to crash at the first sign of an issue. A solid product is something that you've spent the time to make sure that there's going to be no significant holes that need to be filled later. It's clean code, it's well written, well architected, and it's going to be long lived if you treat it right. That last term is kind of a rare case. Unfailable design is something that I coined when I was working on a project with a company called Deep Local. This is something where, in cases where there are significant issues, you need all fail cases to be fail safe. So more verbosely, a unfailably designed application will not crash, will handle any issues elegantly, and will always be running or always have a safe and user acceptable exit case. Like I said, you're just going to get better at this over time. It's absolutely awesome and really good for your personal and professional life to just put in the time to practice benchmarks, put in the time to practice the mental process of calculating these hours, and you're going to get better and better at it as it goes on. And it's going to be more and more useful the better you are. I put avoid oath at all possible because it can be a dangerous thing to say. I know for sure that it's going to take me this amount of hours and I'll have it done, when you never know if there's some black box application that's going to crash or if Meetup is going to go down. And I put oaths there instead of the word promises because I'm sure some of you have worked in JavaScript and I didn't want to trigger anyone's PTSD. So how do we leverage this information in a constructive and useful way? Obviously, you're going to want to give these numbers to clients and any relevant parties that are working on the project. So again, employers, managers, end users, even if you are working on an application personally, you can give it to yourself, take a step back, imagine what a client would say, how they would respond, how they would prioritize items if this was something that you were paying a lot of money for. And when you're working in an environment that allows flexibility for feature set planning, so if you're at the beginning of a new Scrum cycle and you are trying to figure out which features you want to add, you can imagine a matrix of high use and high effort as opposed to low use and low effort. You want to find the thing that is the most highly used, lowest effort, and get that done first. I believe it was Theodore Roosevelt who had a grid. No, I'm sorry, it was Andrew Garfield, Canton alum, but he had a grid that was the tasks that were most important, least important, most stressful, and least stressful. And he would always do the least stressful, most important tasks first, and then move his way around the grid. That's a lot of what I've based this methodology on. A happy side effect of this is if you set numbers that are perfectly reasonable, there's always a chance that something's going to work out nicely and you are going to be able to exceed those expectations. You are going to be able to do things a lot faster than anyone would have expected you to. And it is a great feeling, I can tell you from experience, to be able to say, this will probably take 16 hours, have everyone look at it, figure that that's completely reasonable, and then get it done in an hour and feel like you're the king of the world, the superhero. I personally believe that Iron Man is the patron saint of software engineering superheroes, but I'm sure there are some exceptionally passionate comic book fans that are mad at me for saying that. So I'd like to dive into the first example, which I affectionately called Bad DevOps. The way that I've set up these examples is it's the same situation in two different development environments. In both situations, you're going to be working on a nav bar for a travel agency website. So in this first situation, we are looking at a not so great environment. You're going to be getting these slides either on the YouTube channel, or I'm sure Mark can send these out when Meetup gets its act together. But I'm not going to dive in fully to what we have for the Quanta here. But if you want to take a deeper look, you absolutely can after this. So this is a situation where we're breaking things down into figuring out what endpoints need to be accessed on this black box weather API, and what needs to be sent over those endpoints, and how the data is being sent back in response, and then how we're displaying that data. Those are the sort of things that you're going to treat as your quanta. So like I said, adding a button can be a quanta. Testing a feature can be a quanta. And I usually refer to testing as trying to break, because that's, let's be honest, a more earnest way of approaching it. But it is always a good idea, especially when you are working in an environment that has a not well-established DevOps DevOps team, or DevOps manager, or DevOps documentation and processes, to break things down as much as possible, to ask questions in ways that orient your end users and orient your team and non-technical personnel or clients in such a way that they are giving you information or context on what these quanta are going to be. So in this case, one of the requirements, quote unquote, that the end user has given you is that it must look good. And I'm sure if I were to say the phrase, can you make this button really pop, that some people are gonna roll their eyes out of familiarity. But how I like to handle that here is finding examples of existing styles and existing design choices that have been previously approved or praised or generally well received, even if that means very little response, and ripping them off a little bit. I like the idea of development being noticed as little as possible, and that is striving towards that end. So if you're able to find examples of things that have been well received in the past, that's a good starting point. If you're not, it's a great idea to reach out to whoever the end user is and do your best to provide options and examples, and then work whatever is most well received into the end product. which is another thing that you can do during your benchmarking phase, especially if you're someone who works in UIs a lot, front-end development, application development for mobile or web development. You can create a lot of different style options, and when somebody assigns you a task, you can just say, okay, which of these do you want it to look most like? It's always a good idea to provide options rather than fill in the blanks. The second example we're going to be looking at, this is the happier, more well-established side of this coin, and I somewhat sarcastically changed it from a travel agency to an adventure travel podcast blog, but you can take your own judgments on that one. And if you look through and compare these two examples, the requirements are pretty much the same, but the situation is very, very different. So in this setup, we have a weather API that's been used before and documented. And how this affects your quanta, you have a lot more flexibility to add nice-to-have features, to prioritize important functionality, and add in anything that you think might be a crowd pleaser. So if I were doing this and I was designing a navigation bar, I would usually put the first example at around 2 to 3 hours for a solid product, to use a term that I introduced earlier, which might be faster, might be slower, depending on the situation. There's a lot of unknown variables. I do, as I've mentioned, incorporate testing into that, and it is always helpful to have that as part of your thought process before you go into any hour or task division planning. But there are situations where you'll have testing automated, and those are unfortunately rare, but as they become more common, as unit testing becomes more of an accepted and ubiquitously practiced skill, you'll have more time to break out tasks into need to haves and nice to haves. And honestly, between a really good dev shop and a really bad dev shop, I would assign tasks the same amount of time, but in a good dev shop, the remaining time after the functionality is completed would be more dedicated to improving, stabilizing, cleaning, and adding nice to haves. And in a bad dev shop, I would orient that time much more towards testing, towards request and requirement gathering, and towards approval and changing based on the ever-moving goalposts that are business users' requirements and ideas for functionality. So that's pretty much all I've got to share with you today. I have some space here, as I mentioned, for questions and answers, and I've included a great quote from Einstein. I think it's from Einstein, but you know, you never know on the internet when you read something. But the floor is open, so if anyone has anything, feel free to ask.
John, how do you, I guess, is there any specific method that you use to break tasks down into like quanta sized pieces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of different approaches that you can take for that. The first is to say, what is the smallest possible feature that someone would ask me for? And if you get to a point where something is small enough to where it would only ever be requested when included in a larger feature set, that might be too small to have as your quanta. The other approach you could take to it is, what is the most componentizable feature that we can put in here? So anyone who's worked in any sort of object-oriented programming or in any of the component-based modern web frameworks, be that Flask or React or Vue, Angular, Go, or anything like that, Gin, rather. But you're going to want to split those down into the smallest possible thing that you could fit into an external library and realistically export as a tool to be used by another developer. Of course, this is a very personal process, so you might come up with another methodology to split into your quanta.
Cool. Does anybody else have questions or thoughts?
I do have to apologize because I was only able to join kind of towards the tail end of this, but just generally speaking, overarchingly, in terms of gathering requirements, to meet expectations, is there a singular kind of area that sticks out to you that if you're not getting answers on something that you would investigate more deeply? Like what is a good indication to you that like requirements are not clearly set?
I think typically the way that I approach it is a pessimistic optimism. So if I am not certain that I have clear requirements, I assume that the requirements are nebulous and that this person has some idea in their head of what they want it to look like, but they don't even know. So if I get specifics, put this style on this button, or implement this data structure in these tables in this database, that's going to be something that you can translate pretty quickly into quanta. But if it is create a table that has this type of data in it, create a table to manage the cars for our repair shop, anything that isn't already hyper-specific, I'm going to treat as a nebulous request and pursue more information, or at the very least pursue options to be presented as potential avenues of development. Great question, by the way. Anyone have any other questions?
I have a question, and maybe this should be obvious, but this is the first time I've heard the word quanta before. Do you have another way of describing what this is? Like I'm halfway thinking.
Absolutely. So it's kind of exactly what it sounds like through this process, or through this presentation. It's just the smallest possible unit. So a quanta of mass is something or it is the smallest measurable unit of mass. The quanta of length in physics, as of now, is the Planck length. That is the amount of the distance that light will travel in the smallest possible unit of time, which is the Planck time. Those are all quanta. So a quanta, or quantum, is the plural form of it. Or I'm sorry, is the singular form of it.
Okay,
now I'm confused. All right.
That's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like quantum.
You know what I mean. Mm-hmm.
Something like that. Yeah, like octopuses.
Yeah,
That's-
exactly.
Is this a word that like is this a you word, or is this something that you've heard other people use and you picked up on it, or where did this come from?
So I first read this in a forum as applies to software engineering. I think it was actually Stack Exchange DevOps forum or DevOps thread, but I don't know if it's super widely used. I know it is widely used in other forms of engineering and physical science, but I am a big fan of taking existing scientific terms and applying them practically to software engineering. So
Yeah,
Jo-
it's a great visual. I like it a lot.
thank you.
John,
I
can you go back 2 slides so we can take a look at those example yeah,
sure, absolutely.
that was helping me understand it
Hmm.
the best, I think.
Yep.
Lindsay.
So it is exactly what you'd expect. It's the smallest possible work you could be doing in a given day. And for different people, that might look different. So don't feel bad or confused if this is not at all what you will be dealing with. There is going to be some skill translation here, no matter what aspect of software engineering you interact with.
And your formula was essentially like 1 hour, like one thing that you measure as a quanta is going to equal 1 hour as determined by the level of quality that the end
Mhm.
user is looking for.
Right. So if I'm adding a button, I know I can get that done in 5 minutes. I know if I want it to look nice, it might take me 10 minutes. I know if I want it to exist within a already implemented navigation menu, that might take me additional time just to test and match everything up perfectly, both stylistically from the back end in the repository itself and stylistically from a UI perspective. So I would treat that as a quanta. I would say it's 10 minutes to add a button, have it look nice. I can multiply that by the amount of buttons I need to add or the amount of whatever functionality or control that I need to implement. Multiply that by the quality, separated out purely arbitrarily just by those heuristics. It's just something that I use as a sort of mental shortcut, and you can feel free to steal that or implement your own kind of categorization of different levels of quality in your software products. Things like mockups versus stable products versus minimum viable products and so on.
Sean, did you have something, or did it end up getting answered in that back and forth?
No, I was going to ask, like, do you have an experience or an idea of how to map this to sort of common SDLCs like Scrum? Like, where would you fit the benchmarking into a Scrum process?
So benchmarking is typically going to be something that you're going to be doing on your own time, just because it is more of a measure of your level of ability. Whereas using these quanta and this actual formula in a conversation is going to be something in Scrum in particular would happen in either the retrospective or the planning phase.
Okay.
And
do
of
you
course,
have a
Go ahead.
have a means or a way of like reflecting uncertainty? So like
Yep.
looking at this example here, that weather API in the bad DevOps case, it's not well documented. So there's some uncertainty about what is involved in authenticating to it, maybe.
Sure.
How do
Yeah.
we reflect that?
So the simplest way, and the one that I use most often, is just to say this will take between 1 hour and 4 hours, depending on some unknown factors that I'm still gathering information on. And it's always a good idea to keep whatever end user or client you're dealing with in constant communication. Mark and I have said before, flood them with communication, give them more than they need. Worst case scenario, they can hit do not disturb on their mailbox. Best case scenario, if there's an issue or if someone's questioning, hey, why is this taking so long? You have a written document that's already existing that you can refer to and say, I said it was going to take 4 to 6 hours. We're in hour 5. This is why we're dealing with it. If we need to, we can switch gears and head in a different direction. So that answer the question?
Yep, thanks.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Well, John, thank you for presenting tonight. This was cool to take a look at how you go about like estimating the tasks that you're doing on a daily basis. I hope everyone found this helpful or interesting. And yeah, I appreciate everyone attending tonight. Sorry about the issues that Meetup was having. And yeah, we'll meet again next month on the 3rd Thursday. I got to announce the event yesterday, and it should be a good time. So everyone enjoy your evenings, and I'll see you next month.
Thanks everyone for having me. Have a good one.